If you want to find us, rethinkresearch.biz. I am a senior analyst and editor. I wear a lot of hats. And if you want to get in touch with me, Alex at rethinkresearch.biz, I'm not great at PowerPoint, so minimal capabilities there, and I'm very good at rambling. So I'm going to try and fit this in so we do have lots of time for Q&A. Rethink has three areas that we focus on. So we have the video and media and entertainment sector, cellular and wireless networks, and then energy and renewables. And across the three, there's two different products. We have these weekly newsletters, which have been running since 2002. And then there's associated research and forecasting services. It's all subscription, it's all B2B. And I currently head up Rethink TV as well as Wireless Watch and RAN Research. And I crossed the desk, appeared on the radar from an interview that Linda Hardesty from Fierce carried out. And the impetus for that was the crash of 2033. And if you want to download this, the pinned item there inside forecasts and data inside the video tab on rethinkresearch.biz. But the crash of 2033, essentially it's a marketing exercise for us, right? It's a buzzy paper trying to lay out our kind of view of the world. The first of these 10-year papers arrived in 2003. That was the fault line. Then in 2013, there was the fault line revisited. And that's when I joined. I joined Rethink just after that, straight out of university. The fault line revisited, that was a paid paper, and it was very successful. It sold a lot of copies. It made a name for Rethink. And when I joined, I was launching an IoT service, Internet of Things. And we ran Riot until 2020. It was a bit of an experimentation vehicle for us to see if we could do different business models. And the short answer is no. Subscription newsletters is apparently the way to do it. So after that, we sort of moved me back into video. So I took over Rethink TV. In 2023, one of our co-founders left, Caroline. She was heading up the wireless group, so I took that on. And then later in the year, our CEO Peter passed away unexpectedly, and so we didn't get the third installment out in 2033. It came out in 2024, and that was myself and my colleague Tommy. So the crash, the name itself, is describing a prediction that 2033 is when the big sports leagues finally go direct to consumer. That's when video delivery, production, technology is good enough for them to cut the middleman out. We're moving from pay TV and DTT into this OTT era, and in time it will become obvious to them that they can make more money by billing the customer directly. So there's 10 points in there, really, and 6 of them are directly relevant to this conference, I think. And the gist of them are here, and I will explain it, but I'm setting the scene because I'm going to talk us through in this presentation the logic behind this paper. And I'm not going to try and bum you out too much, but I do find it's a bit dour sometimes. But this first point is that this new generation of consumers, and I mean, I'm on the edge of one of this, I get, but these are going to be actual cord nevers. Like that term has been used before, but here, cord never is a generation of consumers that will just never purchase a fixed line broadband package. They will use their smartphones as their primary media consumption devices, and they're just completely absent from the pay TV ecosystem. In kind of parallel, the viewing audience as a concept is just fracturing apart quicker and quicker. We are seeing hyper personalization and hyper personalized advertising coming to the fore as the way to monetize this. And these consumers are moving into their own kind of separate digital realities, right? We don't have these big water cooler moments anymore, besides really live sports. And we can see that live sports is sort of struggling to engage the the viewers. That they're quite good at fandoms, but they're not particularly good at encouraging these younger consumers to tune in and watch. And these younger consumers are going to start viewing these televisions as the big screen that they occasionally put something on. So casting into the TV, maybe it's through Matters integration. Maybe that's the way forward in a few years when the various consumer electronic groups finally, sort themselves out, and we have a kind of standard way to do things. But the TV to these consumers is just not really important. It's a nice to have in some ways. So because of this, the sort of fixed broadband value proposition is as a utility, it's kind of a dead end. It's going to be very difficult to sell these younger consumers who view a smartphone as their digital life. It's going to be very difficult to sell them a gigabit broadband package. They don't see the value in it, and we're already seeing mobile M&A coming and buying fiber assets as a way to shore up their sort of backhaul networks. And to be clear, I'm not saying that fixed broadband just gets ripped out and it's done away with. It will have a role to play. There will be ways to use those networks for backhaul and front haul, but for the consumer, it's a thing that's in the house in the same way that, say, a smart meter, a water meter, a gas hookup is. It's just a piece that is in the building that they don't really do anything with. So Hollywood gets unseated as the main driver of content revenue. We move to a world where social media, gaming, podcasting, user generated content is the primary stuff being consumed. Lots of highlights, lots of short form. There's going to be a lot more parasocial relationships between the viewers and the creators. And it becomes much more kind of community driven and insular. Point six, which I think has popped up now. There's a role here for hybrid delivery. In the US, of course, ATSC 3.0 is of great interest, but I think is struggling from lack of like native integration into the hardware. Might change down the line, but basically until Apple puts it in an iPhone, it's somewhat irrelevant to that generation of consumer. 5G broadcast solves some of that in terms of the end viewing device compatibility, but then the next step beyond that for the NO really is 5G multicast broadcast services, which is going to be a way to offload a lot of the live linear traffic into a broadcast function. And that's, maybe if we don't end up in open caching and multicast ABR and whatnot, there's a lot of avenues we could dive down on that point. But the sort of other points are kind of relevant. I'll just finish them off. AI becomes very important in the creation process and production and partly distribution. Is still quite gimmicky now, of course. It's very overhyped, but it's going to get a lot better. There's going to be a new wave of codecs, so we're going to see the follow-on to VVC, which again is like barely in the market now, even though it's been finalized since I think 2020. But that has to play out, and there's going to be a lot of machine-to-machine video where video streams, like entire video streams, are created and never watched by a human. It's going to be another machine that's monitoring them. It's a lot of video traffic. It's got to flow over all these networks. If you take a strong view of the Internet of Things, then it's an enormous amount of traffic and also money. But it's not for a human viewing. Piracy is going to come back. I'm going to dive into the macroeconomic reasons very shortly, but people don't have as much discretionary income and spending as they do historically. So piracy is going to come through. You've got all these great anecdotes, right, of a parent watching a child that is watching a Twitch stream that's pulled from somebody's YouTube stream, which is a Facebook rip of somebody at a Taylor Swift concert. Like the tools that exist for like watermarking and stuff along that chain aren't really up to scratch now. So I think that's just going to let piracy come back, and that's a new wave. And then finally, there's this green angle where distribution and also production too will be prioritizing the sustainability angle. And so instead of like the technology being the thing that sells you, it's going to be the sustainability credentials. And largely that comes down to electricity and the cost of that. So this is the logic. These are the hunches. And the if part is if a new generation of consumers use a smartphone as their primary media consumption devices, and cellular network quality improves with 5G standalone, direct to device, and then eventually 6G, so that you get better indoor penetration, better mobile capabilities, perhaps even the beginning of some of this metaverse stuff. And current macroeconomic and demographic trends persist, so that we get our aging populations, our increasing rents and house prices, the falling fertility rates, the higher student debt load, general oligarchy in this disinformation age, climate migration pressures on these economies, and then climate change in general, then the fixed line broadband value proposition, including pay TV, collapses. That's that's the logic of the crash of 2033 kind of laid out. And of course, there are some caveats. So we're a small team. It's impossible for us to actually like forecast each of these pieces. So you're relying on a lot of third-party data. If that data comes from a vendor, there's obviously a commercial bias. If it comes from an operator, they tend to be too focused on the next few quarters rather than the next few years. So they're not zoomed out enough. And of course, in the background of all of this are large consultancies, which you have to be a bit wary of. So it's essentially impossible for me, for us to like accurately predict all these data points. But this is us like sifting all of our contacts, all of our experience, that massive archive we've got. And so the goal of the paper, of course, is to make a splash. It is marketing. It's out there to capture attention. And so some of it is written to be quite buzzy. So a bit on me. And this is why, right? This is my perspective, my point of view. 33, graduated university 2013. I studied English literature. Um, I've lived through five once in a lifetime economic downturns, which hasn't been great. There are ongoing supply chain crises from COVID and 2 decades of the Afghan war. We've got the second phase of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Liz Truss, our infamously short-lived prime minister, like ruined my remortgaging. That's a very personal gripe, very specific to this side of the pond. There's tensions in the Middle East, and the Taiwan Strait dispute is hotting up again. So that all informs how I view the world. But I am trying to defer to facts, and I'm intentionally trying to avoid cherry picking things. So, put simply, I think the generation under me, so really it's Gen Z, but you've also got Gen A as well, the Alpha. They are very different to me and you. They behave in strange manners to us, they consume strange content, and they are already very tired of people pointing this out. They find it really hard to take life advice from a generation that, in their view, have created the current material condition. You know, it's hard to take computer advice from someone that you watch struggle to like operate a car. Like, you know, there's elements of this, right? And generally, like they're sort of, and I don't know how much of this is conscious and explicit, but they're very aware that they do not have it as good as their parents, and they will not have it as good as their parents. That this is we're at the top. This is in many ways quite a sort of North American, Western European centric view, but it does appear in other economies. And so here's the first of the charts. I'm going to try and zip through these, but what this is showing is the changing makeup of the UK population. You've got 1972, 2022, 2072. This is pulled from Census and Office of National Statistics. So in 72, what you see is the bottom of this stack is wider than the middle and the top. So this is our post-war baby boom, and also the generation that came from the post-war baby boom. And at the top of this stack, you see there's very few people that are older than 90. And the sort of chunk that is above 70 is really quite small. And the middle of it is, you know, kind of thin compared to the bottom, or thinner. 2022, we're seeing this play out, right? The big chunk at the bottom has moved up into the sort of middle age, like up into the 50s. And we've also seen the impact of like new medicine on the aging population, like the improvements that you see in the technology and the science there. So there's quite a lot of people now who are over 90 and plenty that are over 80 who retired in their 60s in the UK case. And so then if you project that forward, you get the stack on the right, which is the 2072 forecast. And here, that middle chunk is now significantly larger than the younger chunk down the bottom. And also the chunk at the top, the very elderly who require lots of care, has jumped up again. And so those put strain on society, like any society. And if there's more old people and fewer younger people, there's less income tax going around, you've got more social care costs, like that is a problem. And I don't think it's being addressed very well. And I think it's only going to get worse, right? This is a different way to view that chart. This is showing births, and I hope you can see it okay in the room. But there's these two grey bars which are showing you the world wars, and you can see in World War II we've got our record low of about 600,000 births in the UK. Then you see the spike, the post-war baby boom, the 60s baby boom. And if you follow the line across, you'll notice that it's come down to essentially the same levels, the World War II baby boom. Sorry, the World War II low. And in 1945, 38 million people in the UK. In 2020, it's 67 million people. So despite having plenty more people, 27 million odd, like it's not far off 40%, we have far fewer births. And this is seen in nearly all the developed economies. And so like the sort of World War II um, aftermath, it's 42 people per one birth. And in 2020, it's 111 people per birth. So the fertility rate, when you look at it that way, 2.3 down to 1.75. And there is kind of a reason for this, and it is neoliberalism. This is now somewhat of a pejorative term, but neoliberalism emerges post 1970s. It's the roaring 80s, it's Thatcher and Reagan, right? It's a philosophical, like economic approach, and the sort of tenet of it is this near religious faith in the free market, that the free market will correct all of these problems that the state has to oversee. And as we all know, the free market is not free, it's heavily regulated. And if you're in telecoms, you're aware of how much regulation goes into it. Like, wouldn't it be terrible if people started broadcasting on specific frequencies willy-nilly? It just wouldn't work. And yeah, the impact of neoliberalism can be seen in graphs like these. So this is the age that women marry and then the age that they have their first child. And this goes 1860 over on the far left, and it's 2020 over on the far right. I'm not sure if everyone can see the date, so I'm just going to play it safe. But you can see how sort of World War II, you get that dive. The post-World War II marriage rate comes down to nearly 22, and then it continues to drop through to the 70s. And then once we're into the 80s, it absolutely rockets up. So it goes from 21 roughly to 29 within a very short amount of time. And you see a similar thing happen in the age that women have their first child, where it shoots up from just under 24 to, again, nearly up to 29. And over on the right, I've got some very glib phrases that people of my generation are often hearing, right? So a bit tongue in cheek, a bit of levity. But you see jokes like this online fairly often, where it's just pointing out, there's a lot of reasons why this happens. Like, people tend to prefer to have children when they feel they can look after them well. And if it turns out that you've got all this additional societal pressure and economic pressure to, make a good nest, well, it's going to take you longer in life. And this isn't just a Western problem. You see this in China, which had that infamous one-child policy for a very long time. Japan is probably the best example of the issues that are sitting there. And if you sort of plot this forward, a fertility rate that drops from just above 2 to 1.4 doesn't sound like a massive issue. But if you go 3 generations forward, the amount of people still alive means you end up with something like a 70% population reduction, which is enormous. Like I said, this isn't just a West Europe, North American thing. You see this, you can see that top line. This is the UN data, but there is the slowing of the Asia population growth. But the African population growth is rocketing upwards, and that seems to only start to level off past 2100, which is yeah, probably well beyond my time. And the gap has closed between the EU and the US as well. So this is pulling from the US Center for Disease Control and Prevention and post-war baby booming in the EU for obvious reasons, pretty sizable. And it has kind of collapsed down to what the US level is. And the sort of population of Europe is significantly larger than the United States. And you can kind of see what's happened. The US economy has been stronger for longer. And so you won't see this for a while in the US, but it's looming. And the quotes on the side are, attributing why this is happening. And I mean, I've touched on them, so I shan't just recite these to you, but there's sort of fairly well recognized reasons. This is the real price of an average UK house, real meaning it's been adjusted for inflation. I think this is a really good example of the change that's happened since we had the sort of implementation of neoliberal economic policies. And in 1980, the average house price, £131,000. So that's probably about $150,000. By 2000, we've increased by 35% to £177,651. And then in 2020, we're up 61% to £286,000. So within the 40-year span, the price has increased by 118%. There's a lot of reasons for that in terms of housing stock and whatnot. But if you are a young person trying to, make their start in the world, then that's problematic. And I'm not an economist, right? But these graphs are pulled from the ONS, the Office of National Statistics. And I think what I'm trying to show here is that a lot of the traditional sort of economic thinking and economic logic hasn't really proven out. There's a lot going on, a lot of things to consider. So you've got job vacancies falling. So you presume that unemployment is also falling, but you don't see that. The employment rate seems to be flat as well, even though our vacancies are coming down, and our real earnings are sort of all over the shop. So you're seeing declines through sort of COVID and Brexit and whatnot, but they're not increasing. And the sort of kind of archaic logic, right, was if there are jobs and you pay more for them, then you will fill them. And we don't see that. There's lots of reasons why people don't want to work currently. And the UK is basically wage stagnation. There are other things as well. You've got a essentially newly created £250 billion problem, which you're applying to the discretionary income and spending of young people. This is money that isn't really re-entering the economy. And I'll touch on that why, but all of these financial pressures don't conform to the old logic of if a landlord takes a rent, well, they'll spend that rent locally. They'll employ a local person to look after the garden. They'll employ local builders to sort the roof out. We're not really seeing that so much anymore. Like it's not really playing out. So in some ways, right, the old version, money isn't kind of real anymore. It's not tangible. And this is the kind of graph that sort of shows this. This is 1925 all the way on the left and 2025 all the way on the right. And the vertical axis is actually percentages. So this is trying to show how financial commodities have become the thing that is traded. So, or in 1925, it is 100% real assets, so real estate and commodities and things. By 80s, you have the peak, the war on inflation, and then it just collapses. So by 2020, it's about 5-7% of real assets in the total amount of financial trading. So The Big Short, good film, shows you a very small snippet of this in the way that the financial markets were sort of repackaging mortgages, but that's happening all over the shop. So money these days, it doesn't represent like tangible things. And I kind of quip right that the end goal is life as a service. The idea that the consumer doesn't own anything, they just pay for access to these things. That seems to be the end result of a lot of these historic trends. This is from Oxfam. They are a charity. They publish a wealth inequality study. The gist of it is that the amount of wealth owned by billionaires has gone up by $2 trillion in 2024. That is $5.7 billion a day, which is ending up in billionaire wallets. So, where did it come from? Well, it's people lower down the chain. And there's a kind of a global view of this as well, the global north, the global south, where $30 million an hour of money, whatever that is moving from south to north. So you're going to see increased kind of equality on that front. And the sort of advice is tax people more. And there's a caveat, the World Bank at the bottom, the number of people in poverty hasn't changed since 1990, and that's at a global scale. I'm not actually sure if the World Bank has adjusted for the population growth, because obviously as a proportion that will change, but you'd hope they had, right? So that's follow up. So this is immigration, an extremely hot button topic in Europe and the UK. So 2021 up to 2022, big spike. It's post COVID. You've got sort of continual pressure from the Syrian civil war and Ukraine, of course. There's ongoing civil wars in Ethiopia, Myanmar, Sudan as well, Gaza, the Maghreb and Sahel region in Africa. And we're starting to see the beginning of climate change based immigration. And obviously, this is like a contentious point because, as I pointed out before, with the population collapse, if you have jobs in a country that need doing, currently the only way to keep up with it is to bring immigrants into the country to do the jobs. And there's all sorts of anecdotes, right, of the native citizens not wanting to do those sorts of jobs, often because they're not particularly nice jobs. But the disparity that drives these immigration forces means you're quite happy to move to a country like the UK to lie on your stomach while a tractor drives you around a field and you pick asparagus all day, and then you move to the next farm after a few months. Like Brits don't want to do that, but Eastern Europeans have propped that industry up for quite a long time. The somewhat official data often contains terms that can be quite charged. This is unauthorized immigrants, but there's disparity because if I talk about European immigration, I actually mean immigration to generally these countries. And in Europe as well, you've got the levers that are being pulled from the poorer states, which are essentially funneling these immigrant routes across to the more developed countries, and they're often used for like political power, which is quite greasy. That's not particularly nice, but it's a politically charged problem, and it's only really going to get worse. This is climate change based internal migration. So by 2050, 6.1% of the North African population is going to be internally displaced. And in East Asia, 1.9%. In Sub-Saharan Africa, 3.5%. Well, a lot of the people that have been displaced by climate change are going to move to these other regions. And I couldn't get the numbers on North America and Europe, but even in those regions, you're going to get places that just are not going to be particularly nice to live in 2050. So there's going to be more societal pressure. So yeah, extreme weather events, extreme heat. You've got crop failures that are compounding issues, conflicts. You'll get a lot more wars in these sorts of regions because of these problems. You're going to have rising sea levels as well, and it's just going to put a lot of pressure on these other economies, and it's going to lead to serious political upheaval and tension. And here is where I finally start being so depressing. But I've tried not to be a complete doomer about this. But I do have to ask these questions, and I'm interested in the answers, right? But I agree, a lot of this stuff is going to be very, very contentious. But like, what hope do you have that things will like drastically improve through this period? Do you trust political leaders or the political apparatus to move the needle on any of these problems, like significantly? And like, just how much wealth can the billionaire class extract before the current kind of crumbling, big air quotes, free market capitalist model like completely falls apart? Like, how much further can this go? Like, how many times can we reinvent the wheel? And what's the kind of logical end conclusion? And underpinning all of that is telecoms, right? It's a utility. And just returning back to the points in the crash, I think that is why I think this way. And I spent a lot of time thinking about it. As for sort of specific points for operators, there used to obviously be very like specific divides between the types of operator, and it was based on the technology that they were using. Operator is a term which is a catch-all. It's not a very good one, but I also don't think referring to all of them as different things works anymore because there's too much overlap. But now nearly all the incumbent telcos have a mobile service. Nearly all the cable cos have an MVNO service. And how long until they go full MNO? Um, as I said before, like nearly all the MNOs have fixed line services, and they're continually purchasing fiber because they know it's important to their network densification needs. And pay TV is still dying. Like, that's not a contentious thing to say. It's been quite clear that it's in decline. But most of these incumbent operators have or have had a video service. And if you go pure like IP and you shift all of your linear stuff from unicast into multicast and you can cache it all across this network, then you can kind of preserve the sort of lean back EPG based channel hopping consumption model. But referring to the crash piece, like how long until sports, which is the thing that props all of this up, pulls away when cables direct to consumer. So that's that's a kind of view, I think, really. And T-Mobile for a long time was an exception, but of course it's got into fixed wireless access and now is buying fiber. So it kind of ruined the unicorn status that it had for all that time. So again, those are the hunches, right? So if smartphone, you consumer, and cellular networks are improving and macroeconomic conditions persist, then fixed line broadband, including pay TV, is kind of at a crossroads. But the blame, I guess, is entirely the fault of the operators. And here I'm talking more about the mobile operators, admittedly. But with 3G, they collectively spent an incredible amount of money on spectrum, which then forced their hand because they had to reclaim that money by charging a lot. So you had bonkers pricing for video calling and for sending MMS messages, so sending photo, like actually using these new functions was prohibitively expensive, which then pushed consumers towards over-the-top applications. This is why like WhatsApp is such a big thing globally. And in that kind of 4G era, the operators had to watch as they lost control of like telephony, of like the core thing that phones used to do. It kind of disappeared from their books. They just provide data and voice, but you could go VoIP. There was no reason really that you had to stay on a phone. There was a period, right, where an iPod Touch was nearly all you needed. As long as you had Wi-Fi, you could get basically the entire smartphone experience from an iPod. And because of this, the sort of value of data became the main thing. So the SMS messaging and the calls were just thrown at the consumer. They were table stakes. And then there was awkward delineation in the pricing where if you tried to price it per gigabyte, nothing made sense anymore. And then in 5G, they sort of raced into it. They believed the hype that the consultancies had sold them. And they'd sort of backed themselves into a corner and then shot their foot off. So you had the unlimited data plan, and that was the end of it. It was just a matter of money or bundling. You didn't have any way to sort of differentiate this. And there was plenty of like anecdotal evidence about coverage and I don't use this mobile operator because in my house it doesn't work. That's changing. Like that's being sorted out by Wi-Fi convergence and public networks and that kind of thing. So, like, what was the point of 5G? Like, what did it bring to the table? And the answer for consumer is like, well, basically nothing. Right? In fact, the switch off from 3G has actually made the experience worse for a lot of them. And they got no say over that. You can't go to a 3G network anymore because like all of them are sort of moving in phase. But network slicing, when they try and do things like pay us $5 extra and you'll get, the best possible gaming, cloud streaming performance, that's just going to rub the consumer up the wrong way. Like that's an admission that they're not being given the best network. And I'm already paying quite a lot. and I can't go anywhere else for this. So why do I have to pay the extra piece? Like that's a difficult sales like process. And on the enterprise side, private networks was a big thing, again, partly via network slicing. But if you're an enterprise, you don't trust the public macro network. You want a network you have control of. You want to plug it into your Wi-Fi system that you probably run already, and you don't have a great view of these big MNOs when it comes to like security and the sort of support side of things, which is why about 80% of the private network market is done by integrators and by vendors, and maybe it's 20% operator. So spectral efficiency of 5G, well, yeah, that's good. Consumers don't care. And the operational efficiency, well, you've still got the 2G, you've still probably got bits of 3G lurking around. There's 4G. Were you dumb enough to dive into 5G non-standalone? Well, good, you've got to try and port that. And so the 5G promise in terms of the operational efficiency doesn't pay off for another sort of 4 or 5 years when you can actually shut down all of the legacy junk. And this is not particularly surprising. Like, I know I sound like quite jaded, and I am, but I sort of watched as all the IoT hype that I was really excited. You know, it's my first job, my first area that I'm covering. I watched it all move into blockchain. I was like, well, that's dumb. And then all of that moved into like the cryptocurrency, the NFT stuff, and that was even dumber. And then we had all of that hype moving into 5G, which again, like didn't pan out. And then we saw metaverse with, you know, the kind of coinciding with COVID. And now it's into AI, right? So there's this sub sort of ecosystem of marketers, the PR types, the investors, they're all looking for the next big thing. The operators are quite gullible. They are easily led. You know, you're the operator. You run a national network. You're foundational to digital life. You should control this. You should have your say in this. You should try and buy it and do it yourself. Doesn't work. And in sort of larger plays, you had M&A as a way out of this. So AT&T buying Time Warner, Verizon buying Yahoo, a way to sort of merge like the media and the mobile side of it. Infamously bad decisions, didn't pan out, and sort of opened the door then for like the T-Mobile Sprint acquisition, which was kind of foundational in creating the Dish 5G network, right? Open RAN, no legacy headache, greenfield in many ways. This should have been it, right? This was going to be our test case, the thing that proved to the world how valuable Open RAN was, and Dish just hasn't done very well. Dish has fewer mobile subscribers now than it did back then, through just kind of hemorrhaging the MVNO crowd that it kind of inherited. And over in the EU, the traditional regulatory approach was that these operators should not be allowed to buy each other. They should operate inside each of the member states and be distinct from each other. And that led to the operators trying to like manage all these different pieces. And you couldn't really buy one set top to run in all the markets. Like you had to have different pieces. And now the EU is taking like kind of a different stance. It's almost encouraging the operators to merge, and the idea is that scale will kind of help. But I when I took over the wireless thing, I'd obviously been covering it through like an IoT lens for a long time, but I sort of radicalized myself there. I saw just how like poor the operators are, and I think they're just institutionally incapable of like digging themselves out of this hole. They're kind of bloated. There's too much legacy stuff in there. They're very entrenched in the way they approach problems. So they're just kind of like rotting, and they're very inefficient, and they're just terribly reliant on their vendors. And that's a vicious cycle. It's not good for the vendor to have to employ so many integrators like on staff and engineers and developers just to be able to like install products inside an MNO. That's not good for them. And the operators have kind of gone from being the centers of R&D and development to outsourcing it. I don't think you can take like a philosophical stance on that. It's just a thing that's happened, but I think you can say that it's probably not good. It's probably been for the worse. And at Mobile World Congress, just one example was from an IoT MVNO called Once, which was like a spin out from Deutsche Telekom. And the IT support cost for a SIM in Once is about 15 cents a year. And they were saying, yeah, in a tier one MNO, it's more like $5. And if you trust the Ericsson number of 8 billion SIMs, or 8 billion by $5, if I haven't goofed the math up, that's a $40 billion annual problem in just one piece of the stack. So just think how much money is actually being wasted by this community at like every layer across the pay TV, fixed line broadband, the mobile, like all of that is an enormous headache. And yeah, 5G didn't pay the bills. They rushed into it. They, as I said, they sort of seeded the field to the kind of 3G greed. They're sort of stuck in a corner. They've been burnt by all these promises about, robo surgery and whatnot. And yeah, there's a capex crunch, right? There's bad to no return on capital invested. So this is a problem that leads you to some decisions. And one of these is obviously like selling off towers. Um, and I don't know, I've always thought that the selling off the tower piece felt quite myopic, like quite short-sighted. It felt like robbing Peter to pay Paul. And if half of these promises about how important the network is are true, well, why are you selling off it? Why are you allowing someone else to make a profit on it? Why isn't that being kept in house? Like, why can't you sort this problem out? Um, I think it's like an oscillation, right, between capex versus opex. There are parallels between on-prem and cloud, and we're now seeing some of the high intensity workloads coming back on-prem because it turns out it's cheaper to not pay someone a 30%, 50% profit margin when you could run it in your own back office somewhere. And yeah, it feels like MBAs have kind of convinced the MNOs about this. And unless you fix the underlying problem, which is the stagnant ARPU, then what happens when we get this problem again after 6G? Like, I can't sell my tower fleet anymore. I've already sold it once. So, my advice, if I've got my tinfoil hat on, I think this is how it'll go because of the private equity pressure. But I think the MNOs should slash will move the MNOs into MVNOs. And there's quite a lot of MNOs that do own MVNOs. That lets you retain the customers in a very kind of lean business. You then spin off the actual MNO to some ruthless VC, ruthless private equity type who will just optimize it with not a scalpel, but probably like a hatchet. And then you buy your connectivity services from that MNO, whatever that is. And yes, I do see the irony of just complaining about the tower example being myopic, but how else do they solve that problem? And I've been talking for a very long time, so I'll just rattle through some of these. But this is a data set that we use, which is our sort of North America top. I think this is 6 operators here, maybe it's 7. But this is historic revenue, capex, opex, and then like a very simple progression forward. And you'll see that revenue is declining while opex is increasing, and capex is increasing. And that is manageable if incomes are going up, but on the way that they report operating income now, it's essentially flat, and the net incomes are declining, and that's a worse view in Europe because the net incomes actually go negative. And I've just clocked that there's a pop up on the whiteboard in the room, so I'll try and describe this as best I can. But the capex is outpacing anything that's happening in operating incomes, net incomes, which is obviously yeah, not great. It's not sustainable, I would propose. And then moving on to the actual like consumer customer counts. There's mobile at the top. You can see the sort of T-Mobile Sprint acquisition, that big lump, but then it sort of levels out. It's fairly stable growth and it's fairly valuable, right? $157 billion of mobile connectivity. Fixed broadband is increasing through the period, of course, and pay TV is declining. The video customer count is falling. And if you were able to, these sorts of counts should be, I think, where you focus, because if you can make a similar margin on an AVOD or an SVOD service, probably not fast. Fast is a bit of a basket case. You can probably be quite picky. I don't think you would choose to enter the actual like foundational connectivity side of things because it's hard. It's hard and expensive, and the margins aren't very good. So yeah, you probably want to be targeting the stuff that's built on top of these services. And I think that's what the operators are quite sour about, because at one point they did own the entire thing. Like everything you did on that network, you had to pay them for, and they let that slip away. So just rounding it out, just comes back to the sort of points I was making about like the underpinning like logic here. and I hope I haven't bummed everyone out too much, but we'll go to audience Q&A. I'm not sure how this is going to work, so I'll sit tight and yeah, hopefully you enjoyed it.
Alex, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for a very interesting and in-depth presentation. We had some snags here that I had to attend to, so I didn't catch all of it. So, but I
That's all
think
right.
what it will do is turn it over to the audience, and I'll pass the mic around, and we'll see how it works. Who could raise your hand?
Alex, thank you for the uplifting presentation this morning.
Not a problem.
Yeah, one of the items you mentioned was that there was a real concern about the lack of, of large televisions being used as these newer generation of folks are not as interested in viewing items.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to understand what you mean by that, because it sounds like younger generations may not have an interest in gathering in rooms together.
Yeah, that's part of it. The amount of younger people, because these were traditionally the best consumers, right? They were young. They had that was the point in their life where they had the most disposable income. So this was who you tried to sell new cars to, the latest technology. You know, they would finish their university, they'd start a trade, and they'd very quickly buy a house, start a family. But that is happening later and later. And I think the if you've been at university or you've been in a trade college or you've been studying at home, you have the smartphone and the laptop maybe. And for a lot of people now, it's not finish and go buy a house. It's finish and move back in with your parents for like 3, 5 years. And I think that dynamic creates like quite an entrenched behavior where you are like up in your room by yourself for a bit quiet. You don't want to watch the same things your parents do. Like maybe you'll watch a football game that you have like a joint interest in. But I think that kind of sit down, lean back, large scale viewing experience um, is diminishing. So I think that's roughly it, right? And then the TV is it's a thing that might be in they might have one in their room, but it's probably not plugged into the same kind of set top system or home gateway, like whatever way it's happening. It's probably a hand me down TV, right? Or the cheapest thing they could buy in Best Buy. And I think that's where the casting uh, part comes in, so that there will be some things on the phone that you will cast to the television. I think that's how I view it. I've rambled. I'm sorry.
It certainly sounds like you're expecting the television usage to focus on the individual side and less in a group setting or a social environment.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Like it, like so much of this is like um, anecdotal and subjective, but the the extent to which even stuff now that is watched on the communal television is actually the primary screen is massively up for debate. Like how much viewing happens with a smartphone, like within arm's reach, like how much is within it's the smartphone is in someone's hand. Like I remember when I started writing about this stuff, second screen meant the phone, and there were all these like ideas that you could have, like polls and interactive things on the second screen. You could do trivia while people watch the thing, on the big screen. But now I think the phone is the more engaging thing. So yeah, that dynamic is odd, and unfortunately, I haven't got any concrete numbers for you.
I've got two daughters, one's 26 and one's 28, and everything you've said is exactly that. Um, the ones, yeah, and they both are watching sports. And sometimes what they'll do, and you see people going out now to some of these restaurants, and they may be watching the game on the big screen up there, but they also got their phone right there, and they're either looking at something there. So it is a different dynamics of them gathering around the TV versus where if they'll say, well, they're going to come over and watch. Yes, they will flash it.
Yeah.
If they're going to have multiple people, but they still have their individual phones looking at what they look at. So I'm tied to a cable TV.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
I'm
it's an
not looking at my
incredibly
phone to see it unless I want to hear it while I'm driving or something like that to
yeah,
go pick up the pizza and come back or something like that. So
yeah. The sort of sports on a big TV is like an incredibly sticky like proposition. But there will come a time when the CFOs and the cable company has to look at it and go, how much am I paying for all this like DOCSIS infrastructure that is being used by this tiny subset of my customer base? And then that's when you have some like existential rip and replace questions. But like I don't think that leads to like a big migration of customers into another product or service because while that very sticky user base is committed to watching live sports, and news is the other one that dominates watch times, the sort of younger generations are just moving entirely separate from that world, you know? Like, I think that's the key piece.
A quick question, if I can get two questions in. And I guess the first one is, given the current times here in the United States, right? And what I heard from you, I think, is you're proposing less regulation overall for all aspects of society, that maybe the EU is overregulated and created some of these problems? That's the first question. And I guess the second question is, maybe you can talk on the handsets themselves, right? The Android or the Apple ecosystem, and does that play into your thinking?
Yeah. So the regulation part, I think we should all remember the kind of disputes between the kind of throttling that Comcast was, almost certainly doing to Netflix. I don't think there's anything public I can disclose there, but we remember what that looked like, and there's an interesting kind of net neutrality angle, which is I think a lot of the early net neutrality thinking and fears and proposals came when those ISPs were the kind of the suspected problem that people were worried about the ISP itself, like doing the clamping down. Um, I think what we've seen, and like there is that famous term, the enshittification of the web, right? It wasn't the ISPs that were the issue; it was the web platforms. So that's like a net neutrality question. The EU piece was a kind of competition based view, which was that it is preferable to have four operators in each country, and that each each country should kind of be independent, and that you shouldn't be letting a dominant or like an incumbent in Germany buy an incumbent in France and buy an incumbent in Spain. And you've seen some of that happen. Like Orange from France has obviously bought Orange in Spain, and then Vodafone from the UK like greatly expanded, and then the wheels fell off. But the European piece is this fairly recent call for there were these two big competition reports, and one came out from Draghi and one came from Letta, so technocrats, and those are calling for like the digital single market. They're also calling for like fair trade. Like they've tried doing that a few times. The GSMA has pushed for it, and Thierry Breton just decided to like punt on that. So I think the landscape in Europe is going to change pretty substantially. In the US, I think the incoming administration, well, the current administration is probably going to be fine with Comcast buying someone, whereas the FTC in previous administrations probably wouldn't let that happen. So I think you could have some seriously big M&A activity on that front, and I think convergence will be the big thing. Like that will be how one of the big cable companies becomes a mobile network operator. Like they'll probably just buy someone, and I mean, Dish is a basket case, like you can probably buy that one fairly well. The handsets, yeah, in I think I mentioned handsets when I was talking about ATSC 3.0. And I think my point there is like, especially in the US where the iPhone is a majority of smartphones, um, there is just no real point in trying to get onto a smartphone unless Apple puts it in the phone. And so like native ATSC 3.0, there's one phone, you know, it comes out of Sankhya Labs, which is like an Indian outlet, but like it's possible, but not great. And then the broadcasters, like 5G native broadcast, like 5GB, which is EMBMS, like you had 4G EMBMS. That's a way to do it. And I think for the like that would be native, but again, it's like how do you encourage a young like Gen Z, Gen Alpha to essentially fire up an EPG on their phone, like flip through channels? Like that just doesn't sound particularly plausible or engaging. Whereas if you've got like an entrenched viewer who is on the go and knows that they should be tuning into their specific program at this specific time. Well, if it's on a phone, then great. Like you can watch it, I guess. But yeah, the 5G MBS stuff is really interesting, but it's still very early days. And there's more like foundational architectural questions about the shift from unicast to multicast. So
Do we have any thank you. Do we have any questions from the online things or in the chat room? I saw one come up on the main screen. Maybe just read off the chat if.
Karen Ashmead from Orange County. I think the only way to get younger people re-engaged in cable and TV watching in the living room would be to ban social media. That's where their interest is. They socialize and meet people, and for better or worse, many of them even get their news from social platforms. And me, Carrie, my 19-year-old son told me the other day that he gets all his news from social media, and he thought he did a good job of it.
yeah, I think this speaks to the separate digital realities that people live in, and that they'll have specific influences that they care about, or maybe it's specific sports stars, or yeah, the sort of celebrity cultures, and the overlap between those is just it's going to be very fractured, and it's a question that sports guys have to sort of work out how to keep people engaged. And there's some interesting like anecdotal stuff on how younger audiences prefer to watch highlights rather than the full game. And I mean, I'm a Chicago Bears fan. Like I watch the broadcast and whatnot, and it is painful sometimes. And you can see how younger people, when if they sat down in front of that, right, would just they'd find it like completely alien, and it just wouldn't be engaging. So there's you got to have like a pipeline. So maybe that's a way to re-engage in like the cable ecosystem, and cable is in pay TV and therefore sports. Yeah, social media. I mean, we saw the various jockeying and horse trading in the TikTok ban and Meta's sort of reaction and whatnot. And maybe there was a chance, right, that the FTC could retroactively hive off Instagram from Facebook, but I don't think it's happening in the next 4 years. So I think the social media bits are here to stay, and it's probably not for better. It is probably for worse.